But I'm welcoming everyone here to our discussion of the Page Fence Giants. My friend and colleague Mitch Lutzke has written a book that should have been written 10 or 15 years ago, but like many other things in baseball, just never got done for some reason. And I'm very grateful that he did it, because Page Fence is one of those legendary clubs that everyone loves to talk about, particularly their record in 1895, but basically no one knew shit about, except for Mitch. Now we have Mitch's book and we know a lot about it, and we're discovering a little bit more as we go on. So this is one of those books that takes years of work to do, for which there's probably, I don't know Mitch's contract, but I'm guessing there isn't a lot of monetary reward. It is truly a labor of love, and we in SABR, we in Michigan, and we as baseball fans are always grateful for people like Mitch. This is what makes baseball history. You know, one of the things I tell people who don't know about SABR and don't know about baseball history is, and they really don't believe me, is that Major League Baseball has nothing to do with baseball history. They create history, but they don't curate history or research history. Virtually every important discovery or chronicle of baseball history is done by amateurs or people outside Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball has no interest in it until they can make money on it. And generally it's after somebody like Mitch does all the work and they decide to hold a festival or a tribute and sell tickets. So with that, I want to introduce Mitch and have Mitch say something about his book before we, well, actually he's going to talk for a while and then we'll take questions. So Mitch, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. I've been trying to share my screen here and it will not do it, even though I supposedly have the ability. So I was trying to do this and it will not let me do it. I'm actually at school because the internet in our portion of town has been out most of the day. So I'm at place number 2, but I have 2 monitors, and when I shared my screen, it didn't, it said it was sharing, but it didn't do anything.
Hey, Mitch, I made you a host. If you want to try it again, see if that did it. We did have it earlier, and now we don't, so I don't know what the issue is, but
okay,
try it
this
if you'd like.
screen 2, highlight, share.
Yep.
Did it do something?
Yep.
Oh, okay. It doesn't, it still shows me. Okay, so there's the cover of my book, which I'm very happy with. And this is from McFarland Publishing, which is a publishing company in North Carolina. And so I fell into this book, and I know I spoke with Gary yesterday. He thought maybe if I could give like 3 things I learned as I was doing my work on this, to kind of maybe hook some people into this who are not real familiar with this team. And so, and I'll kind of tell you the backstory and hopefully take some questions here. I've probably done 45 book talks around the state of Michigan, done a couple of Zoom in Kentucky and Ohio, and gone to Indiana. So I've done a lot of these, and I really enjoy it. And it kind of sometimes reminds me of being in the classroom, because as an adult with high school kids, I teach history and sociology and video class. I'm often this, not every single minute, but I'm usually kind of the authority in the room. And during my speeches, a lot of people are not familiar with the Page Fence Giants. A few people are. So if you have prior knowledge of these people, please ask me probing questions. And if you're just learning about them, you can ask whatever question you want. But basically, the 3 things I learned was, number 1 is that in 1896, this team based in Adrian, Michigan, was the avowed, accepted, unchallenged world champions of black baseball. And you would think with that acceptance that you would hear more about them. In the white league, it was the Baltimore Oriole team won it that year. And you certainly know about that if you're a baseball person and you go back to the 1800s. But that was one shocking thing to me, that everybody agreed this team was the champions in black baseball, and there was almost no coverage about them other than a few paragraphs at the end of the year. So that was one thing I learned, that I didn't know they were a championship team. And then I also learned that they had almost no coverage, even though they were a championship team. Second of all, I was shocked at the amount of fans that they drew to many communities. oftentimes, if you took the surrounding area, 50% of the county or 50% of a town would show up to these elaborate ball games, usually a doubleheader. And I'm thinking, we seem to know about the Wild West shows of Annie Oakley and Wild, Buffalo Bill Cody, because they would draw about the same amount to their touring circuses, and they've become mythical proportions in American lore. And the Page Fence Giants were going to the same towns and doing the same traveling, and nobody knew about these people. So that was striking to me. And obviously the racial component is key in that, with the Page Fence Giants being African American. And the third thing, I thought I knew after researching my family tree for almost 40 years and doing lots of research on 2 previous books. I was a clueless white guy thinking that the same robust information that you would come across in the local papers, things like birth records, death records, marriage records, stories about church gatherings, just the hubbub gossip in the 1890s in this country that most white people in a small town would find about their relatives, was pretty much missing in the 11 states and the province of Ontario that I came across in newspaper research. So the information was not covered by contemporary media on a consistent basis. It was very hit or miss. And so when people will say, well, even if we fast forward to the 1920s start of the modern Negro Leagues, why don't we know more about the statistical makeup of teams, box scores, line scores, game by game write-up? That information doesn't exist. It was not covered. And I was clueless about that. I mean, I had an idea as somebody who had written 2 previous history books, one around the Civil War time and ended in the 1920s, and another about local history in town. But I was, to use a British term, gobsmacked to find how little the white media covered the comings and goings, either of the day-by-day operations of the team, the ball games itself, and then the social lives of the ball players was non-existent. So that was very eye-opening and gave me some challenges I had to overcome to put together this book that's about 260 or 70 pages.
So that's a great way of introducing this, Mitch. And of course, we think of them as a fabulous story, but the reality, sadly, is in their day, to white people, they were mostly a minstrel show. You think that's fair? I mean, they were black people who came to town and they were this curiosity, and the local guys, the local athletes wanted to beat them to prove they were superior. And then that was the end of it. No one cared about the team, the players. No one cared about the best black baseball team because they didn't care about black baseball.
I would equate it, Garrett, I think you make a lot of correct points. I would almost equate it to the Harlem Globetrotters. It was a big event. People came to town. You may know 1 or 2 of the players. They would publicize in the newspaper in towns that had publicity ahead of it that was printed in the newspaper. And then the team would play. They normally destroyed the local team, whether it was a minor league team, semi-pros with ringers, and then they would go on their merry way. One of the highlights that I saw in the first year that was mentioned a couple of times the second year, and I couldn't find it in the third or fourth year, was the players were given Monarch brand bicycles. In 1895, they were bright red, and they would ride around the street of the town, and they would have red firemen's hats on, is what they were called, and they would probably sing and kind of piper the people and go to the ballpark. And so it became kind of an event, a curiosity to see African-American ball players. And then they came to your town, and there was a lot of betting. People bet on the games and the outcomes, and they left. And so it was a curiosity to see in mostly white communities this fabulous group of ball players based in basically Adrian, Michigan. And we'll talk about that in a minute, why Adrian was selected. But it was interesting because they played, 150, 170 games for the 4 years, and they won it, about 85, 90%, but there was so little follow-up from the communities, and even the last 2 years in Adrian didn't really do much. But it was like the circus coming to town, but the athletic circus coming to town. And again, that's why I kind of juxtapose that with, Annie Oakley and, Buffalo Bill. There's been movies and Broadway shows and things on them. And the Page Fence Giants went about 125 years with basically about 2 or 3 newspaper articles and some writings in some scholarly journals that were only a few pages long.
Right, Mitch, I think you made a good point there in passing. I was trying to think about one of the reasons, it's always bugged me since reading your book, but what a big deal the Page Fence Giants were in 1895 and 96, and how they weren't on a glide path to like dissolution, like they disintegrated within 2 years. And I know they didn't really disintegrate. They went to Chicago, became the Columbia Giants, which was an important team in its own right. But in terms of Adrian and the value to the Page Fence Company, they disintegrated. And I was trying to figure out why that would be true. And one of my thoughts was, well, when you beat the piss out of the white boys in any given town, you're not going to get invited back. A lot of the black teams tried to calibrate their margin of victory.
Yeah.
But what you said triggered something else. I forgot about the gambling angle. Since there was so much gambling, it was legal. Well, if you're betting on the white team because you think they're going to beat these black boys, and the black boys just destroy the local team, well, there's not going to be any betting or any fun the next time around. You're not going to invite them back because you know you're going to lose. So that, in some sense, then, by traveling extensively and playing 150 to 200 games a year, they're wearing out their welcome, not because they did anything wrong, but because their welcome was based on them being a novelty act that you could bet against.
Right. And one of the ways they would mitigate that tension, which I go on in my book, is they would sing songs. If the game got out of hand, they would cartwheel between the bases on homers. A guy named Billy Holland, who is a sometime pitcher, outfielder, he's called a great coacher. And back then the coacher was kind of like your bench jockey, and you would rattle the other team and you could kind of put on a show in the box. One of the greatest coachers in white baseball was Arlie Latham in the 1890s. And these guys would yell jokes and things. And so they understood, with the social makeup of the communities, nearly all white in many cases, and the Ku Klux Klan is running around in these communities, that you need to get out of town. And also, you wanted to be invited back. So I'm sure the margin of victories in some of these games were shaved. But also, you were the marketing tool for the Page Fence Company. And Adrian is the fence city of the world, fence capital of the world in the 1890s until probably the early 19-teens. They had about 6 or 7 fence companies. So the idea was, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's okay, that the Page Fence, named after J. Wallace Page, you would have your local fence distributor at the local hardware store or grain elevator would have some samples at the ballpark or the ball field or wherever you were playing inside of the horse racing track, the fairgrounds, and you would have samples of the Page Fence. And basically the idea was, hey, if you think this ball team is of high quality and whipping up your local guys, what do you think about the quality of our fence? And so it was a marketing tool. So you really can't go into some town and win, 37-0 and, 52-2, because it's going to leave a stain. And I think that was a component. And so they did have the ability to, I'm not sure if they called it shadow ball, but they would do drills and things to entertain the folks, because they could figure out real quickly, probably just through warm-ups, how difficult this team would be. A couple of times they started their cook. They played a game in Romeo, Michigan, and Wendell Gaskin was the pitcher. He got knocked out in the second inning. And then Albert Carter pitched a couple of games, and I think a guy named Henry, last name of Henry. So they could size up the opponents pretty well. And so the whole idea that we're playing baseball, but the African Americans had this whole underlying checklist, like we're marketing for the company that's bankrolling us. Okay, remind that. Remind that the Klan is walking around. How much can you embarrass the local yokels? We want to come back, especially if we have good crowds, because they got a cut of the gate. They got a guarantee plus a cut of the gate. And you want to be, nobody wants to hire the snob patrol to show up in your town, and you want this to be a yearly endeavor so people come back not only to games if you're coming back through the town that year, but also when you're booking games in 1896, 97, 98. So you had to be gracious in losses and gracious in victory. And so that is a component that the white ball clubs didn't have to worry about it. They just kind of went out and played. They played for fun or they played to whatever. But one of the components in my book is, and I think that it's unique from other baseball books or many baseball books, is that I'm going to read this from my preface. Actually, a woman who calls herself not a baseball fan, but she loves the Red Sox, and she was a retired English professor. And she said, I loved your preface to the book. I'm glad, because I actually read 3 books to write my 6-page preface, because I wanted to kind of get the lay of the land. But I said, the constant complaints of unfair umpires over the team's tenure impacts the overall statistical output of each player on the mound and at the plate. The racist nature of some of these umpires and opposing players skew statistical analysis in ways no one is able to measure. Simply put, game scores and statistics don't tell you what you need to know about this team, these men in the country. This book is the story of Adrian's Page Fence Giants, and not a book only geared towards stat heads and baseball nerds. And I think that's important to put the team in a context, not only a baseball context and a context of athletics in America at the time, but also in the social political background. And teaching sociology and US history, context is important. And I didn't have a lot of box scores to go from, like maybe 50 box scores and 400 games and some line scores. But to me, it was important to talk about the untold hurdles that this team had to overcome. Adrian had an African-American community, but it was still a majority white town with a majority white college, so it was progressive. The company was owned by white people. The management was integrated for the first couple of months. Part owners were both black and white men. And then the whole racial component that I've spoken about. And I think that's important because too often, especially with Jackie Robinson, I mean, I've read several books on him. He was a rascal growing up, and he was a black rights advocate. And if you know anything about his service in the military, he was not going to be put in the back of the bus. And I think too often baseball just says, oh, here's Jackie, and they parade him out, and everybody wears 42. I mean, he was a militant, and it was surprising that he went with Nixon and backed him in 70 and 71 and 72. But I think they don't talk about the whole social component and the other ball players that were washed out. And it took, 12 years from Jackie in 47 to the last black players were integrating teams in the league. That's 12 years of people pushing back. So I really wanted to write a book that was interesting to people who didn't really follow baseball, or they maybe just followed the local team, Cubs, Tigers, whatever, Lugnuts, or maybe their high school team, but to place them in the context of civil rights, of the political nature of the time, and to place them in a proper historical context, to know what type of hurdles they were going over, in addition to just playing ball with umpires that may be a little shaky because there's black ball players and the umpires were white. That was important to me, and that's how I sold the story to McFarland, my publishers, and they were great with me. They gave me a word limit, which I easily blasted through. And I said, I really want to write this story this long. I think it's 132,000 words. They said, how about 80,000? I'm like, can you go 120? And ends up, because it's fully footnoted and sources are bibliographied. And I don't think there's going to be another book on the Page Fence Giants. And it took 125 years to write this one. So I really thought it needed to be written in a way that would be of interest to people. And when I started thinking about doing this book, I asked people who I knew were not sports fans. I knew who they were. And I said, look, I'm looking to write a book. Let me throw you this premise. A traveling professional ball team with their own fancy leather interior train car travels across the Midwest and beats teams and so on and so on. And they're like, I told them, they said, is this like real? I'm like, yeah. And I said I would put them in the proper historical, context or whatever. And people that I knew were not sports fans, because I've known them for a while, they're like, this is kind of interesting. This would pique my interest, because I think too many baseball books are written for baseball people who spend most of their time to find the errors in the book. And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted this to be a broader scope book. And with my interest in sociology and my interest in racial relations and growing up in an integrated community my whole life, it was important to me to try to paint a broad stroke and not just recap 4 years of box scores and games and try to make my case for people in the Baseball Hall of Fame. I wanted people to get the lay of the land. So I talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the worst court rulings ever in the history of the United States that allowed separate but equal and basically codified Jim Crow laws in the South as backed by the Supreme Court. And that happened in 1896, though the case took 5 years to roll from the East Louisiana Railroad Company up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I've had some people, actually, I get more positive comments from people who are casual sports fans, but are history people. They've kind of posted and talked to me and reached out to me, maybe as powerfully or maybe more powerfully than some baseball people who wanted me to come up with more numbers. I'm like, there aren't numbers. The Sporting News had about 5 box scores in 4 years. And so people have been disappointed that there wasn't more robust numbers. I'm like, okay, but that's not the way it works. So I'm really happy and proud of this book. And it's been out for like 3 years, and it won a Michigan Notable Book Award. And they sent me around the state with a couple of authors to speak about this. And then it won within the SABR community, the Jerry Malloy Black Baseball Committee, the Robert Peterson Award. And I got that, which I'm very proud of. And so I think, I know it's been 3 years, but I think the book stands the test of time. It's exactly what I wanted to write. I wanted to have a rhythm and a feel to it. And I think it accomplished that. I also wrote it like 4 times, basically. I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, because I really wanted to it be more of a story as opposed to regurgitations of baseball facts. And I hope I accomplished that.
Well, I think you did, Mitch, and I want to congratulate you, because one of the things that bugs me about coverage of the Negro Leagues and black baseball is people who are well disposed toward this, they're not trying to put black players down and prove something, want to make these guys into one-dimensional heroes. Oh, they played for the love of the game. Well, that's horseshit. They played for the love of the game. They played for money. They played because they were athletes and they were good at what they did. They played because there were lots of women in every town. They played because it was a better job than working in the mines or working in the cotton fields. They played because they liked being famous. They played because they wanted to see, somebody from the rural South wanted to see the rest of the country. They played for a dozen reasons, just like anyone else does stuff. They weren't just one-dimensional cardboard characters. And your book told me a lot of stuff about most of these guys that I never knew. I mean, I knew a little bit. Well, actually, I knew a little more than a little bit about Bud Fowler. There's not a lot to know, as you know. And I knew, a fair amount about Grant Homer and Johnson, but most of the other guys were just names to me. And, your book fills it in context. For me, it's better than having box scores and stats, because we were talking about clowning before. Another thing that bugs me is people who say the Negro League teams all clowned. Well, no, they didn't.
No.
Not every team clowned. Not every team clowned every game, except maybe the Indianapolis Clowns and the Ethiopian Clowns and teams that was their motif. That was their calling card. Most Negro League teams did some clowning. Not every player in the team would clown. They wouldn't clown all the time, they would calculate this. It was a fine calculation. Oh, are we beating them so badly the fans are going to have a go away feeling PO'd and we're not going to get invited back? And maybe we don't even get our money. Maybe we don't even get the right, they'll cheat us on the gate. Well, let's liven it up a little bit. Let's gear back. So instead of, an 8-0 lead, we let them score 4 or 5 runs. We can always score more if we want. Let's liven it up a little bit. It was a very sophisticated calculation of marketing, entertainment, and baseball. And that to me is much more interesting. And your book is much more interesting than a book about box scores, because the box scores are suspect. These guys, I'm just taking a guess. Let's say their average score in those games was, 9-3 or something. They probably could have won most of those games 12-1 or 12-2 if they really put the pedal to the metal, but they didn't want to. They were there as entertainers. They weren't winning a pennant or a championship. The games that they didn't want to lose to these town teams or these white teams, but they weren't in a league in the way we think of it. And even the championship is really more like a cup. It's like at the end of the year, the best teams challenge each other to a cup, and that's who determines a champion. It doesn't matter whether you had 7 losses or 12 losses. It matters that you were good enough to be issuing a challenge and accepting a challenge.
Right. And that was because originally the series was going to be 12 games. It ended up being 17 games. And then the Cuban X Giants claimed it was 19 games. So you're right, because they were making money. So I guess I'm going to kind of go back and kind of talk about the start of the team. I think just to let people know. So what happened was,
Mitch, another thing that your book is great on is dispelling this notion that even I had, that Grant Johnson and Bud Fowler came with the idea, persuaded Grant Johnson. They got somebody in Adrian to fund it, and they basically were the drivers. Well, they were the originators, but they weren't really driving the bus.
Yes. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Again, it doesn't come up the way I want it. Are we looking at a team of a Finley team, of a black and white team right now?
Right.
Okay. And I see Tom's got, Biblewski's got Fleetwood behind him, looks like. So just kind of, let me give you the Cook's tour, what happens here. Baseball is really, really big in Michigan in 1895 and 1894. In 1895, there's a minor league that includes Adrian and Lansing, Michigan, and Kalamazoo, and Bay City, and Owasso. And so what happens is there are these challenge games in 1894, and Adrian, Michigan claims to be the baseball capital of the state of Michigan. They're not. They actually lost 2 out of 3 games in a challenge match to Pontiac and 2 out of 3 games to Monroe, Michigan. But they claim they're the baseball capital of the world. They had the greatest fans, the whole bit. Well, the team I'm showing right now is the Findlay, Ohio Sluggers. And this is the owner, Mr. Drake. On the left here is Grant Home Run Johnson. On the right is Bud Fowler. That was his baseball name. His real name is John Jackson. And they played in 1893 and 1894 on this Findlay team. And a couple of these pitchers actually go to the pros and pitch for several years. They are a semi-professional team, and they traveled around the tri-state area and whipping you pretty badly. Adrian had a team, and let's see if I can, there we go. This is the Adrian Light Guard Armory team. And George Wilson is an 18, maybe 19-year-old pitcher. He's probably 18. And he's hired, and this is Henry Yake from Detroit. He's a left-handed catcher. And they're the local Light Guard Armory team, and they're pretty good. And Wilson is a ringer, and they bring in a couple other ringers. There's like an infielder that's from the Detroit area that's pretty good. And they start playing teams, and they're doing pretty well. Well, they want to make big money, so they invite the Findlay team up in 1894. I'm going back to them. And they're bragging in the paper that they're going to destroy the Findlay team. There's 2 games in August, mid-August of 1894. And the Findlay team comes up, and I believe the first game was something like 19-2, and the second game was like 10-0. And Findlay wins, and it's not even close. But there are huge crowds, and lots of betting and lots of gambling. And Bud Fowler basically does a trial balloon, as we say, and has an interview, and he's known as a guy that's been playing baseball for about 15 years professionally. He's pretty well known in the baseball circles if you're following baseball. And he's like, golly gosh, people, I was going to make a team called like the Findlay Traveling Black Tourists or something. These names changed all the time. And we were going to have a bunch of black players play based in Findlay. But after seeing all the money changing hands in Adrian in August of 1894, if you can come up with a $500 season guarantee for me, I will relocate this team that's only on paper right now in Adrian in 1895. And that's exactly what happens. On September 21st, both the daily newspapers speared across their headlines, Page Fence Giants to be located here, with an interview about Bud Fowler. And he brings Grant Home Run Johnson with him, who reportedly hit 58 homers in the summer of 1894. And they signed this gentleman, George Wilson, from Palmyra, which is 6 miles down the road, who had pitched a pretty decent game against them, all things considered. And so this is the start of the Page Fence Giants. Now, Bud Fowler then in October of 1894 moves to Adrian and spends the winter rounding up black ball players. He's also a barber in town. Adrian is uniquely qualified to host this team for many reasons. Number one, it's on the railroad, and that's how you traveled back then. So you had to be a railroad place, and it was actually the headquarters of the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern's car repair unit and painting unit. So that was a thing. So it was not a whistle stop. It was a major, it was the number one employer until the fence companies took over. Number two is it was a progressive town. We would say liberal today, but it was a progressive town. I read every census report from 1830 to about 1920. And during the time that the town was being developed, and particularly around 1900, 1880, African Americans were dispersed in all 4 wards of the city. There did not appear to be a black end of town or an immigrant end of town. So that meant they were integrated as best as you could be in America in the 1890s into the regular milieu of the town. They had black businesses on Main Street, literally on Main Street, on Maumee, in downtown, and with storefronts. So they were integrated in the main fabric of the community. They had a Black Elks Club and a Masons Club and churches, several churches, and black doctor, nurses, a black clerk at the courthouse, and black children had been going to the Adrian schools for the previous probably 2 decades. So this was a fully integrated community, as you're going to find in the country. In addition, Adrian College had as its president Asa Mahan. Asa Mahan is somebody, if you understand coeducation, he was coming from Oberlin College, which was the first school, I believe, to have like co-eds get degrees and African Americans in a white school, very liberal. And he ends up going to Adrian. Now, the knock against Asa Mahan was his fiery rhetoric from the pulpit probably lured as many students as it scared away. But you have a large entity of educated people who are progressive in the community. So you're on the rail line, you have a black middle class. I think I counted something like 60 or 80 black families in this directory in 1895 that was put out by the chef of the ball team. You have them integrated in the business climate, churches and things. So this was a community that would have been accepting of African Americans. And in addition, the owner of the Page Fence Company, J. Wallace Page, was a Civil War veteran who had been monkeying around in his sheds for a year or for 10 years, trying to come up with fencing that was not as sharp as Joseph Glidden's barbed wire that was invented in 1878. So he's got this mesh type of design, and he decides, after being in Hudson, Michigan for about 18 months, he moves to Adrian about 1888, and about 3 or 4 years later, they have hundreds and hundreds of people employed. So the arrangement that I could concoct from what I could find in bits and pieces was that the train car, and you can see it says Page Fence Giants here, and here's Gus Parsons right here, and these are the Taylor brothers, if I think I have that right. They're co-managers. The Page Fence Company bought this train car, and this is a picture of the Page Fence guys playing someplace. And here's a picture of them in 1896. But the train car was quite elaborate, and it was probably worth about $30,000 in 1890s money. And it was staffed with a porter, barber, and a chef. And so the arrangement was that the Page Fence Company would buy the train car and operate it. That would hook onto the back of, cabooses and regular trains and then be pulled off on the side track. And that the Page Fence Company would not be involved in getting a share of the gate profits, which was quite unique back then. So the owners of the team, which were Bud Fowler and Grant Home Run Johnson, two African-American gentlemen from Findlay Sluggers. And then there were three white guys. Len Hawk, who was a former mayor of Adrian and was the current postmaster. And then the Taylor brothers, who were on the back of that train car, Howard and Rolla, and they had come from Ohio, where their dad was a banker, and they had set up a kind of a hardware store. But by the 1890s, and they had been in town about 20 years, it had morphed to like the #1 sporting goods store in town, and they did a lot of robust business. And they were the co-owners. So it was Len Hawk, the Taylor brothers, Bud Fowler, and Grant Home Run Johnson. And then they hired Gus Parsons, who's in the middle of the screen here. And Gus was a local clerk at the Hotel Emory who had been arrested, about 6 or 7 years before for running illegal gambling dens. And some woman in town went after him because her husband had blown his paycheck at the Hotel Emory or something. And how dare Gus Parsons take money from her kids' mouths or whatever. But he was kind of a man about town. He was their business manager. So this was an integrated, racially integrated business group. And they signed players in 1895, and they go to Marion, Indiana, and they win a couple of kind of scrimmage games, and then they play a team, and they get beat, and then they go to Cincinnati, and they play the Cincinnati Reds in a preseason games, and they get beat pretty soundly in one game, but in the second game they're actually leading halfway through the game, and there are several thousand African Americans, it appears, in the stands, and the ball team hangs on, and the Cincinnati media, for the most part, was very complimentary to the Page Fence Giants. The media in Adrian was tripping all over themselves about these black ball players traveling and representing their town, kind of the Chamber of Commerce on wheels. And then Hawk and Taylor, and maybe some others, maybe Seymour Howell's in this, they decide to put what we would call a team in the White League, the Michigan State League. But they wanted to win it, so they told George Wilson, the pitcher, you are not going to be playing with the Page Fence Giants this year. And they hired a black catcher, Vasco Graham, to be an integrated team. The rest of the league was not integrated. And then throughout the year, there were 4 more Page Fence Giants: Joe Miller, Bill Binga, Pete Burns, and Bud Fowler played at least one game or more with the Page Fence Giants roster. They were thrown to the Adrian Demons. So this management group, the interracial one, ran the Page Fence Giants. The all-white one ran the integrated Adrian Demons. The town was gaga over both. In June, the Page Fence Giants were to play 2 games against the white teams, and the media flipped and basically threw their predictions and their support behind the white ball players. They were annihilated by the Page Fence Giants in 2 games. George Wilson, the star pitcher, had it in his contract. He did not have to pitch against his black former teammates, so he got fined for kind of being a ding-dong on the mound in the 8th inning by lobbing pitches over. And so it kind of became a big brouhaha. But the superiority of the Page Fence Giants was not doubted. And they went and played throughout the summer. The Adrian team did pretty well in the league, but they did not make enough money, and they were shut down. The Page Fence Giants made money every year, and they continued in 1896, 1897, and 1898. So that was a pretty telltale sign that race may play a part of it, but the big color was green, and the Page Fence Giants could rack up 4 years of profits and the Adrian Demons could not, and that was the end of the Adrian Demons. There were some attempts in 96 and 1897 to formulate another minor league team in Adrian, but it didn't work out. So the Page Fence Giants in 1896 have a little turnover on the roster, not too much. They play a series of games in the fall against the Cuban X-Giants, which they win in Cairo, Michigan, the clinching game with surprisingly Grant Home Run Johnson on the mound. It got some coverage in the Sporting News at the end of the year, and then some letters back and forth as to why the Page Fence Giants won. In 1897, they were just as successful. They actually played 2 games against a team out of Chicago in which they thought it was just an exhibition, and the Chicago Unions claimed it was for the World Championship, and they won 1 game or tied 1, and so they lost their title in 1897, according to the Chicago Unions. Then in 1898, they played much fewer games, and then they disbanded for various reasons after the 1898 season and moved, as Gary had mentioned, to Chicago. Just to give you an idea, this is the 1-loss record that I got from the Detroit Free Press article several years later when their advanced agent, J.W. Stevens, was trying to put together another team. He claimed in 1895, the team was 121 wins and 31 losses. 1896, 143 wins, 25 losses. 1897, 129 wins and 10 losses. And 1898, won 107 and lost 10. Now, I will tell you, there's been a couple of deals about, well, they won 72 games in a row. That's not true, because anytime they felt the referees or the umps had been dishonest, they didn't count those games as losses. So some of the mythology on this team is not completely accurate. Here's the Page Fence Company. I think I'm still sharing my screen. Here's where the ball field is today. If you go to Adrian, here's Maumee Street, River Street. This is their city, or their bus garage, and this is their DPW lot. This is a creek here. The Raisin River is right here. The old railroad went right through here. So we think the ball field was kind of here. We know by some maps it was here. This was left field, center field, and right field. And the way I got that was, and here's a drawing from a Sanborn Fire map, balls occasionally hit far enough in left and right field, balls hit long in left and center field would lodge themselves in a creek, never in right field. So that's how I got the field oriented the way I had it. There's another train car. This is William Gaskin. There's a number on here. It says 109, supposedly a number of wins in a row. That actually is not accurate. And then there's actually a movie that I was in by an Adrian College professor that's streamed, I think, on Amazon, about Bud Fowler and the Page Fence Giants. Okay. So this team was fascinating to me, and I knew nothing about them until I wrote my second book, the first one on Williamston history. And Williamston had started the Williamston Baseball Association, a town team, semi-pro team. They wanted to get the Page Fence Giants here, and they did in 1896. But they had mentioned the famous Page Fence Giants, black baseball team, in a couple of the local newspaper articles. I had never heard of these guys, and I consider myself a pretty good authority on baseball, but I'm not, looking back, I wasn't. And I wrote it on a sticky note, and I wrote an article, I wrote a chapter in my book on Williamston history about 1895 baseball, basically the Williamston town team playing other local communities. And I published the book, and I used some of the money for an endowment fund at a local museum I'm on the board at. And then I was kind of bored, and I had a list of topics for a third book, and the Page Fence Giants was not in the top 1 or 2. But I was intrigued by them, and then when I Googled them, and I went to Wikipedia, which of course I tell all my high school students, please don't go to Wikipedia and start quoting that crap. But there was almost nothing on the team, and I found they were world champions. And they gave me names. I was not familiar with Bud Fowler, I don't think, at that time. George Johnson, I was not. George Wilson. or Grant Johnson, excuse me, Fred Van Dyke, James Patterson. These were black ball players I was not familiar with. So I did a little bit more research and thought it was shocking that there was nothing on this team that I would consider adequate. I mean, you couldn't even write like a one-page paper that was on the Wikipedia page, really. So I contacted Adrian, their Lenawee County Historical Society, and I said, do you have any information on the Page Fence Giants? And they're like, yeah, we get a lot of calls and emails. We don't really have much, but we do have, some stuff. So then I reached out because I'm a member of SABR. I blindly wrote people like James Brunson and Larry Lester and a couple other people that I didn't know, only through the directory. And I knew about them through Black Baseball, through some preliminary research. And I still hadn't picked on a topic for my third book. And I wrote them, I said, I'm thinking about doing a book on the Page Fence Giants. And Larry Lester, who didn't know me from anybody, said, this is a book that needs to be written. This is a team that we want to know more about. It's pre-Negro leagues. And James Brunson he was kind of a Vasco Graham catcher fan. He was a fan of him. So he gave me some stuff. I think Leslie Heapy, I think I got a hold of her as well. I'm pretty sure I did. So I'm like, well, there's at least 3 people that are interested in this team. So I drove to Adrian, assuming that if you had the world champion baseball team in 1896, who played for 4 years with the largest employer in town, and by the way, they also employed the black ball players in the offseason if they wanted to stay in town. I was under the false assumption that maybe the championship trophy was in the museum and they had bound volumes of the newspapers and they would have photos and they'd be like, yeah, here's what we got. And I walked into the basement of the Andrew Carnegie built library, which is now the Historical Museum, and they dropped down a manila folder with literally like 5 photocopied pages of newspaper clippings. And I was waiting for the heavens to open up and the hymns to sound and the angels to, shine down. I was just going to dive into this giant information pool and just write the story that nobody had bothered to write. And they knew very little about the team, but they were totally intrigued. So I was totally bummed out when I left Adrian, and I told my wife, I can't get a 25-page paper out of this, let alone a book. So she's like, well, you're going to have to do research. And so I stopped counting after a while because it got to be just ridiculous. I read every edition of the Sporting News from March of 1894 to about June of 1899. And you had to read them because they're scanned very poorly. You can't really do an index search. So I quickly figured out how to find Page Fence Giants area. There was never a master schedule, so I had to find out where they were playing. Then I would write that down and research those towns and those newspapers. And then there was something called the Sporting Life that went out of business 100 years ago. They did have an index search. And that was based out of Philadelphia. So that took me 200 hours to read that. And I did not have enough for a book. It was just really frustrating. So I said, I have to go to Adrian. And I was able to use newspapersonline.com. And I went to Adrian and read, and the State of Michigan Library, thank goodness, had microfilms of most of the Adrian daily newspapers. There were 2 at the time, the Evening Telegram, which was a daily telegram, and the Times and Expositor. Then there was a weekly paper. So I read every issue, and I read every article. I'm not gonna say I read every article, but I figured out how they were laid out because I've gone through old newspapers, and I would read all the personnel stuff and all the church announcements for when they would occasionally mention black preachers and who would go to the church there, and read school news trying to find names of African Americans. So I know all the gossip of people 130 years ago in Adrian that I'm going to go to my grave with. And so I did that. And then I started reading the Detroit Free Press from the days they were there. And then I went to the Chicago papers. And then I was able to go online and do some Google searching. I did 200 hours of just newspaper research. And then I stopped counting because it became overwhelming. Like, who does 400 hours of research and then writes up, a couple of dozen rough drafts? So I was really frustrated. And this would have been in the summer and the fall and the winter of 2015. So I globbed together about 48 pages, I think it was, of 3 chapters, what I call chapters. And I sent, I think, one to Leslie Heapy, Dr. Heapy at Kent State Stark. And she wrote back like, hey, Mitch, you got to kind of do this. And I was like, it was great. It was great. And then I had gone to, in Kansas City, Missouri, the Jerry Malloy conference in the summer of 2016. I took my wife and daughter and said, we're going to Kansas City to the SABR conference. And I walked into Gary Mitchum of McFarland, and I was waiting in line and people were buying books. And I said, Gary, I want to talk to you about a book idea I have. I heard that you might be interested. And he didn't really know me. And I can't remember even if I emailed him ahead of time, but I said it was about the Page Fence Giants. Remember, he stopped doing the book sales and took me off to the corner of this room and says, we got to talk. So we talked about it. And I said I'd written 2 previous books that were both self-published. He says, do you have anything written? I said, yeah, I've got a couple of really rough chapters. I don't care how rough they are. So I went home and gave him like the intro chapter and then like chapters in the middle. And the book wasn't done yet, but kind of, and I sent it to them. And they told me it was going to take months to read it and whatever they do in publishing houses. I don't know what they do. And within about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we want your book. I'm like, it's not really a book, but it's an idea. So we want it. And then, so I spent all of 2016 writing it and turned it in on December 28th, 2016. And then spent 2017 getting photos and doing some more stuff. There was almost no edits or rewrites because I said I'd rewritten most of it 4 different times and worked on it. So there were only, I think, 33 errors, and the errors were like, you know, I put of instead of to and didn't capitalize something. And then I did ask it to be proofread or peer reviewed. And as part of my verbal agreement was to have an African-American peer review it, because being a white guy, and even though I grew up in an integrated community, and I think one of my friends from my community is on, which is cool. I'm a white guy. And so the tone, the feel, the pace, the attitude was very important to me, to not be preachy and to not be preaching to people that know more about their history through their ethnicity and their race than I would. And I got very complimentary reviews. Who my anonymous person was, I don't know. And then there was a white person that gave me some feedback that some was accepted by the publisher and some was like, no, you're fine. So then I changed things. And then they said, you just got to wait. So I turned it in September of 2017 and it came out in April of 2018. And then in January of 2019, I got the Notable Book Award in Michigan. And that kind of changed some things for me and for better. And I've been giving speeches and seminars ever since. And so this is a really hard book to write. I still research the people on the team. I have some ideas. I have folders on every player. I'm trying to find them because these were pre-1920 Negro Leagues, and these people really have fallen through the cracks. Saul White is in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He played on the team for a portion of the first year. But I think a couple others should be considered for the Hall of Fame, including Bud Fowler, for various reasons. But so this is like consume my life, but it's totally changed my writing. It's the best book I've written. It opens some doors to other historical writing and some other projects I'm working on. I will tell you this, that the Lansing Lugnuts minor league team of the Oakland A's are honoring the Page Fence Giants in mid-June with 1895 uniforms that I've been helping them kind of design. I think I'm going to speak to the team. There may be some other things down the road, but I'm liking that it's not a book that just was out there and then landed with a thud. It took a while to get going, and I've sold enough that I'm on like the next level of royalties, which I thought would never happen. But I just love this story. I love these guys. I love this time in American history. Populism is one of my favorite times. And so it all kind of came together for me on a project, on a sticky note, writing a local history book. So that's kind of where I want to, I think I got everything in. I kind of wanted to get in that I thought was important in trying to bring in people that didn't know about the team. They would kind of have a better feeling of it. And then people who did know about the team, maybe some more about the research aspect or how I got there. Cause I always find it interesting listening to authors, how they went about doing things. So I'm going to take a breath and a swig of water, and either Gary or Nathan, I guess, can jump in, or however we're going to do this.
I have a question.
We're going to take questions. Since we have a small group here, you can just raise your hand and Nathan will call on you in turn, or you can put your hand up. I see Tom putting his hand up, and I'm glad to hear from Tom and Tom Bibluski. Or you can send a question to Nathan by chat, and he will read it out at the appropriate time. But I want to thank Mitch for that really fascinating talk. I mean, I want to say your story of how you did the book is almost as unlikely as the Page Fence Giants were. But it is a great story, and it's a good book. And as I said, I'm just grateful to have it. So I'm going to ask Tom to go first because he has a special connection.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Gary. And Mitch, I truly enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
Thanks for writing it. It was a library book, so I'm happy to support our local library. It's sort of like a two-pronged question. My first is a character named Irv Beck.
Yes.
He's a local guy, born and raised and died in Toledo. So if you could comment anything about him when he played for Adrian. And number two, it's sort of like a yes or no answer. Honus Wagner, was he a volunteer coach for Adrian?
I'll do the Irv Beck first. Irv Beck was a white guy who played on the Adrian Demons team. I believe he was mostly a shortstop. Now, I've not done the research for 3 years, and most people don't ask me about the Demons team. Beck, I believe, was also a pretty good at stolen bases. I liked Irv Beck. There were players that you would hear little snippets in the local paper about. And remember, the team was integrated all year. And if you joined the Adrian Demons, you knew that your number one ace pitcher, George Wilson, who finished the year 29-4, was not going anywhere. And the catcher, Vasco Graham, was also not going anywhere. And just to give you kind of an idea, Vasco Graham was given an award by the locals in Adrian for catching most of the games at the end of the year, was given a very nice brooch or something. The second best catcher in the league was a guy named Lou Krieger out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. I always try to get his T206 card, and I always get outbid. But he was the proverbial no-hit defensive catcher. And he plays for like 21 years in the league, and he bats like 172 and 201. But Vasco Graham was the best catcher in the league. Everybody said it. The visiting media said it. Everybody said it. And Lou Krieger was probably the second best catcher and played 21 years in the majors. So that is a comparison that I look at between how good were the black ball players. Graham ends up playing on the Page Fence Giants too. Irv Beck, he came up a couple of times, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but I'm going to speak out of turn. He might have been involved in a fight. Was he the one that got in a fight at the hotel? I can't remember. In my book, there's a falling out among the ball players. I think it's in July of 1895, the Adrian Demon ball players. And the paper is hush-hush about it. But I would have to go back, and I could probably look in because I got a great index because, God, 29 pages typed out. There was a brouhaha at a local, 118, at a local hotel one night. And drinking was involved, and fisticuffs were involved. And, okay, that's not it. And and maybe gambling debts, and I think race might have been involved. I'm looking to see Irv Beck here. I'm just going through here.
Well,
Yeah,
Irv Beck, as you know, had a drinking problem
Yes.
later on in his life.
Yeah.
So that may have been, he may have been a part of that. I also thought that he was pretty young.
Yes.
Like
He
18.
was, and it,
yeah. Maybe younger than that.
And he actually hit a home run off of George Wilson when he was playing for the Mud Hens in Toledo a couple of years later. But there was a situation that I couldn't connect the dots, and my focus was on the Page Fence Giants. The Demons were there because of the shared ownership of the black ball players. But there was apparently some gambling going on. And one of the pitchers, I think it was Jess Derrick, who plays in the majors, he calls out an umpire by name, saying that the umpire is throwing the games in the Michigan State League. And Derrick, I think, gets suspended, and then they cut him. And then there's some other nefarious guys are showing up in a fight, and they jettison about 2 or 3 people. Another guy tries to leave, and they say, you can't leave. I don't know if it was racial, because the 2 best players in the team were black. However, when they went to a team like Kalamazoo, had no use, they basically tried to boycott the Adrian Demons in the MSL because of black ball players. And the commissioner, Walter Mumby, who'd been a kind of an accomplished outfielder and shortstop in the 1880s and 1890s in Michigan and out in, I think, Iowa, he approved the integrated team of the Adrian Demons and approved the contract with the national agreement. And when they tried to run the black players, George Wilson and Vasco Graham, off the team and said they were going to play, basically Walter Mumby said, you're going to forfeit the games to Adrian, and they're taking the guaranteed money and the gate. So Mumby is, I think, an unstudied person. He's from Corunna, Michigan. He doesn't have any kids. I've tried. The commissioner was very much for integration. And so Irv Beck may have been involved in a drinking racial thing. I'm not sure, but he didn't cost his job. But yes, he was quite young. He might have been 19. He was one of the younger players. In terms of Mr. Wagner, Hannes Wagner, one of the things that the publishers were happy about, because they told me and some others, there had been this story that Hannes Wagner only played 3 weeks for the Adrian Demons because they were black players, and he quit in a huff and went back home. And that has been repeated over and over again. And I found that to be an inaccurate situation. Hannes Wagner knew the Taylor brothers, who were the guys that owned the sporting goods store, by Mansfield, Ohio. They were friends through their parents. And they knew about Hannes Wagner. So when the Taylor brothers went to Adrian, and opened up this store, they apparently still were in contact with Hannes Wagner, who is not called Hannes, he's called Johannes at the time. And that's how he's referred to. So he's with some team. I think he played for 4 teams that year in 1895. And so in July, he plays like from July 1st to July 17th, but they get these new uniforms. There's actually a picture, I think, in my book, of Hannes Wagner with the Adrian uniform. Wagner plays second base, I believe, and he's just this wild, spikes flying, Ty Cobb-ish guy, stealing bases, great arm, can hit the ball, young guy. And he's like the star of the league, or one of the rising stars of the league, after 3 weeks. But then he announces his dad is sick in Pennsylvania and he has to go back and tend to him. Well, people said that was a cover, that he didn't want to play with black ball players. Well, I'm like, okay, whatever. Well, a couple of weeks after the 3 weeks, the Adrian papers announced that Johannes Wagner, the young phenom, is coming back to Adrian. The ball team has shipped him a train ticket and he's on his way back. So get ready to buy your tickets for like Thursday's game. He's coming back. However, Wagner had signed, it might have been a team, and again, I didn't do Hannes Wagner stuff, but I think it was like in Sharon, Pennsylvania or something, and they were not going to release him. And they didn't release him. So the Adrian papers are like, here comes Hannes Wagner, and then he doesn't show up. And they said, even though he had family, friend connections with the Taylor brothers in the family for 2 decades or whatever, he's unable to be released from his contract, but we're still working on it. That's that story. So if you believe what is in print, Wagner did not leave in a huff, because when he joined the team, George Wilson was their best player and Vasco Graham was their second best player. They were not going to jettison those 2 people for Hannes Wagner. You were a nobody. The other thing is, there were 2 Taylor brothers. Rolla was really involved with the team and traveled with the team. Howard stayed back at the ranch, so to speak, and ran the business, the hardware store. Rolla dies, and years later, and Howard's left, and there's some like 1930 interview or something. I'm just guessing at the year because it's undated. And he's older, and they ask him about the Page Fence Giants and the whole ownership. And he says, yeah, we had Hannes Wagner for a time, who of course is now a baseball icon by that time. He's like, why did he leave? He's like, oh, I'm not sure. It might've been like the black ball players, but you know, and that's what people took and ran with it. And I'm the last guy to do revisionist history here. But to me, I read 5 years of newspapers. I read the stuff that was going on contemporary. And I'm saying, if you left a team because you didn't like playing with black ball players, you are certainly not going to let the local people write papers saying, I'm coming back, and quote you like I'm coming back, because they're not getting rid of the black ball players. So I think Wagner had been smeared with a racist brush by kind of a silent partner owner 30 years after the fact. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And and as far as he was a manager, I think the only place I've seen that was like on Baseball Reference. He was never, I never read anything like that. He was a manager of the team.
A volunteer coach.
No. He was seen as a young buck that they were gonna, bring the reins in. I never saw that any place at the time. And I will tell you this, the weekly newspaper was run by a guy that was a baseball nut. So he had a lot of the background stuff that the dailies didn't have. One of the dailies publishers was a female who, I'm not sure she was a baseball fan, but she was a sports fan. Her husband dropped dead in 1891, and she got this newspaper. And then the other newspaper, they were okay, the Evening Telegram and Daily Telegram, but there was never any mention of him being management, volunteer coach. He was a young buck that they were trying to rein in his talent. He was only there 3 weeks. So,
Okay.
So
Fair
I
enough.
I never saw that. And I've never heard about that after the fact. One of the things, Tom, I found out was people get a paragraph or 2 on something long ago and they repeat it over and over again. I found the Page Fence Giants is like, this isn't accurate, and it keeps getting repeated. Like, so to me, maybe he said it. I was like a coach on the field at my age. He probably said that, but I heard nothing like that at all, or any indication that he was doing that.
All right. Well, thank you for your answer, Mitch. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. And I have to say that doing research on the Detroit Stars, I would have to say that a third of what everyone thinks is true about the Detroit Stars, which you can find 100 sources on, is just not true. It's just not true. A third of it is partly true, but often misleading. And a third of it might actually be true and, properly interpreted. But you can find this everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go to our other Tom, who I'm sure has some interesting comments and questions as well. Tom, take it away.
Wait, is this Tom Daly from my Boy Scout troop?
Absolutely.
Oh, Tom, okay. This is a homie from Albion. Yeah, his mother and father were sponsors of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. They were both physicians. Dr. Harold Daly was a surgeon, and Miriam Daly is 96 years old, still kicking it.
Still kicking it.
Yeah, and she was a pediatrician, and the whole town of Albion loved them. So Tom, we're Facebook friends, but this is so cool. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, I was just curious. I have not read your book, but I need to. I was kind of curious. 1893, there was a big economic upheaval,
Yes.
market crash, political upheaval, a depression that followed that seems to cover the period of which this baseball team was going on. And how much did that kind of depression was this barnstorming baseball teams and the, I guess, the openness to have a black baseball team playing against whites. How did that all kind of fit in that macro situation?
Very good question, Tom. It is covered in my book. It was actually the worst depression the country had ever had. It was Grover Cleveland's second term of office. It went from 1893 to 1897. It absolutely devastated the farm markets, particularly the corn and wheat markets. You're talking about a drop of 70 to 80% on bushels of corn. It was devastating to the rural areas. And it was one of the reasons that populism came up and they started to kick around the idea of the silver standard, also known as bimetallism, to get off the gold standard. So the rural communities who didn't have much money, they would have, it was a 16-to-1 mint ratio between silver and gold together as opposed to gold. Anyway, it did play a part because it had less money out there, but I think it helped the team. I didn't go into this in my book because it's kind of like economic speculation. People were not traveling to the big cities. They didn't have the money. So if the entertainment could come to your town, then that was going to be of a benefit to you. So I do mention the Depression in there, and it was devastating. However, Adrian being a factory and railroad town, it didn't seem to be impacted. There wasn't a bunch of hue and cry on the media people in town. Now they had reports from like, Hudson and Sand Creek and Palmyra and these farming areas, Rollin, and they would talk about times were tough. But in the factory towns, it didn't seem to be as big of an issue as you would think. So in that context, the Depression probably tamped the gate down in rural communities, maybe, but it also might have boosted it because you probably weren't going to get on the train and go to Grand Rapids or Chicago or Peoria or Fort Wayne because that was too expensive, but you could pay 25 cents a ticket, which is what kind of they were sometimes, to the Page Fence Giants and see people in town. And every once in a while they'd give like discounts for women going to the games and kids were a nickel and so I think it was probably a positive and a negative. But the Page Fence Giants made money all 4 years, traveling out Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, the UP of Michigan, Ontario, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. I don't think they got down the Mason-Dixon line, though I did see something in research recently. They might have played in St. Louis, Missouri, but I never saw a follow-up. So that's an issue. I will tell you what economic impact did end the Page Fence Giants. The trusts, the massive steel trust and the railroad trust. And what happened was, and this is why the team, I think, stopped operating in Adrian and they were sold to an African-American gentleman's club in Chicago, Illinois, and became the Columbia Giants. By about 1896 and 97, people like Vanderbilt and Carnegie were running these massive, they ran the railroads, they ran steel mills, they ran the iron foundries, the copper mines, and all this stuff. And what happened was J. Wallace Page was a self-made man and was not part of the Steel Trust. And there was a meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, where people were going to fight the Steel Trust, and they found out that was not going to happen. But J. Wallace Page said, hey, forget it. So what happened was the Steel Trust basically said, you will use our railroad to ship your finished goods. You will use our railroad to get your raw material, and you'll pay our rates, or else. And he said, we're going to play or else. So he builds a steel mill in Monessen, Pennsylvania. I think I'm saying that name right. And that starts in 1898 or so, and it throws shockwaves across Adrian because the rumor is from newspaper stories in Pennsylvania, he's shutting down the Page Fence Company because the railroads didn't want to ship the steel to him after he made this plant, which was not built yet. So he thought I might have to put the plant next to the steel mill. And so Adrian was panicking because the Lakeshore, the Michigan and Lakeshore Railroad Company had pulled their car plant out of Adrian a few months before, I think, and moved it to Buffalo, New York. So they were looking at losing their 1 and 2 most employers in town. Well, J. Wallace Page got the factory built, but here's the deal. They were like 380 miles behind in creating yards, or 380 miles or something of fencing because they couldn't get the raw materials. So I built this factory. So I think what J. Wallace Page by 1898 said this: I can't send out in 1899 a marketing baseball team in a train car I'm paying for in products I cannot deliver over railroad companies that are not going to be friendly to me. And so I think he said, I have to concentrate on that. He opened the plant and the company stayed around for about another 20 years. But I think that was the handwriting on the wall. By that time, we were coming out of the Great Depression, and we were war gaga because it was the Spanish-American War from April of 1898 to August of 1898. And that people were kind of focused on that. And so it was a good time after 1898, I think, to get out of Dodge, so to speak, with this ball playing team. So the economics played a part, but I think the economic of the Steel Trust was really key in having him change his focus and moving the team and just letting the team go and say, and there was never any details in any of the Adrian papers. It just said the Page Fence Giants are relocating to Chicago, and James Patterson will be the manager again once he quits his job at the Page Fence Company for the summer, moves to Chicago. So there wasn't a lot of blow by blow on this team that had been world champions and been the Chamber of Commerce on wheels for 4 years in Adrian when they left. I mean, they just went out like a zephyr wind, just kind of, there you go. And there was no reckoning in the papers. That's why I read for another year. I'm like, are people poo-pooing this? Are they going to try to steal the team back the next year? Never. They just kind of rode off into the sunset. But that's how the economic portion, I think, played into the team's history.
Cool. Thank you.
Nope, you're welcome. Is there a chat thing here? Let me look here. Okay.
Nathan, you had something you wanted to ask?
Sure, and maybe we might even make this the last question, unless there are others who still want to chime in. But Mitch, thanks for everything you've presented and for your passion for the story. Let me ask you about the. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay.
No, you're not.
Okay. Let me ask you about kind of the larger significance of the story. I mean, you've talked a lot about how they fit into a larger social context and how some of the biggest fans of the book have been not necessarily baseball fans. So on the one hand, it's important to salvage the story of this team as a championship baseball team, as one that was recognized as a national champion, and their story should be told simply for that reason alone on baseball terms, but it is bigger than that. And so how would you summarize or synthesize what the essence of that story is when you talk to the Lugnuts in June, and as the Lugnuts celebrate them in June? What is the larger significance of the larger story of this team that people need to know?
As a historian, I'm always intrigued by who's the first. And what I found teaching is who's ever first is who's still walking around upright at the time. So what I'm saying is, if you say, oh, what woman ran for president? Oh, it's Hillary Clinton. Oh, Geraldine Ferraro was a vice president candidate. Sarah Palin. Do we remember Shirley Chisholm in 1972, people? So I look at this and I'm like, so many people think the first or what has happened, why they can remember it, that's their context of history. That's what they remember. And that must be, oh, that's the first person I remember. And I think it's important because America comes to a screeching halt during the 1890s in terms of racial justice with the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And it basically legalizes, as I said, Jim Crow laws and segregation from top to bottom for the next 60 or 70 years until the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65 under LBJ. And we were still moving forward, even though Reconstruction ended in 1877, there was still this hope that we were gonna put the Civil War behind us and let bygones be bygones. And so you have professional black baseball players like George Stovey, who didn't play for the Page Fence Giants, and Moses Fleetwood Walker, and Bud Fowler, and William Selden, and others who were the pioneers. And then you have this country going, well, we're going to go separate, but unequal, actually, as we know it was played out. And these people just get kicked to the dustbin. So by about 1897, there are like no integrated baseball teams anymore. Saul White had played on a team in 1895 in Fort Wayne that went out of business. But by 1897, there's actually a game where the Page Fence Giants swap a white outfielder with a pitcher so they can get a game going like in Wisconsin. But it just shuts everything down. And so when people say, oh, black baseball started in 1920. Well, that's like saying Notre Dame started football in 1966 with a 10-10 tie with Michigan State. What about win one for the Gipper? What about Paul Hornung? What about who was ever earlier? So I think that this fills a gap, that it wasn't modern 1900s America that embraced black baseball along with the Harlem Renaissance and Bessie Smith and the Cotton Club and jazz music. There was a group of Americans that were embracing integration 30, 40 years earlier. And these people have been kicked to the dustbin. And so I'm going to continue researching these people and trying to find relatives. I've hit some dead ends, and even the white people that were involved, like James Stevens, the official score advance agent, no children. I'm looking at the Taylor family for people. I'm looking at Walter Mumby, the commissioner of the Michigan State League, and standing up for the black players. He got divorced and didn't have any children. I'm trying to find anybody connected to this story to tell you how important it was. And it's not to take away that the 1920 with Rube Foster and the Negro League was not the first, and Buck O'Neill. It has nothing to do with that. It's shining the light wider and more accurately on the entire scope of baseball in the United States, race relations in the United States, racial injustice in the United States, economics in the United States. I want that to be a wide swath of a story, as opposed to focusing on how many home runs did Josh Gibson hit against black teams, as opposed to barnstorming teams. Is it 850 or is it 136? So I want the Power of America story that we're all involved in to shine a light on people that have been ignored for over a century. And that's really like broad, but I think that's what I'm going with. That's kind of what I want to be done. Doggone it, give some props to people, both black and white, because you got the largest employer in the town using black people to be your marketing tool in the 1890s. I mean, look at how many companies today in 2021, they don't have, forget about black or African American, any non-white spokespeople. Think about that, or even females. So, we've come so far, we've come not so far, however you want to look at that. So I just think we need to look at the power of people of all races coming together, telling a story, making money, trying to advance society for the better, and then others like the Klan and other people like Cap Anson and those ilk trying to throw up roadblocks. So I think it's an accurate, fair portrayal of America during this time, told through a vehicle of a traveling black baseball team, and this is what America was like.
And Mitch, I think that's a good place for us to break it.
Okay.
We are very pleased with your talk. I mean, this is probably the fourth time I've heard you talk at length about the Page Fence Giants, and I always learn something. And I do want to stress again that what I really appreciate is that you make these people three-dimensional. You put them in the context of their time. You put them in the context of the white society that they had to navigate.
Right.
And yet you're not making them into superheroes. You're not doing the Josh Gibson put a cape on, flies over tall buildings thing, which too many people do. I mean, Gibson, in my view, is on the short list for the greatest baseball player in history. Doesn't make him Superman. And I look forward to your follow-up in the book when you either write a second edition with a new chapter about the stuff you learned afterward, or you write an erudite article about the things you've learned, because this has been a great thing. And it's also Michigan history. It's not just baseball history. It's not just Adrian history. This is Michigan history. And that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating. That in Michigan in the 1890s, and Michigan was not a big state in terms of dominating things as we think of in the 20th century. That really is a decade later, actually 2 decades later. Michigan is an important state. It's not Pennsylvania. It's not Massachusetts. It's not Virginia. It's not New York. It's not Ohio. It's not
Right.
exactly a backwater, but it's not one of the most prominent states. And so I think this is, an incredible, unusual confluence of events that created this team. And they had a charmed life. It ended too soon, but it's a great story.
Thank you.
Anyway, thanks again. And thanks to Nathan for setting this up. And we hope to see you at our next book club meeting to be announced. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mitch. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan, for stopping in. I know you're
Hey.
busy.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It was definitely worth it. We'll see you on the track.
Yep, you may do that.
Sounds good.
Okay,
See ya.
ya.